34 years. I was just checking in the industry now. So I started off, I grew up in Goa actually. And I can call myself a South Indian primarily because I'm originally a Tamilian. Our ancestors were Tamilian, but they settled in Andhra Pradesh. I never lived in either of those places for long periods. I was born in Kerala and I grew up in Goa. And now I live in Bangalore. So I have spent time in Bombay and Delhi as well. But yes, so you can say I'm a South Indian primarily and Indian at heart, I guess. So of the 34 years that I've spent in the industry, more than 50% has been in the banking financial services sector. And the rest has been across various sectors. And for the last 20 years or so, it's been primarily P&L responsibility of various kinds. And for the last 3 or 4 years, it has been board participation as well, on advisory boards, as well as an independent director on for-profit organizations, as well as the non-advisory kind of boards as well. So that's my background. In terms of where I grew up, like I said, I was born in Kerala and I was brought up in Goa, which is a lovely place to grow up in, with the sea everywhere you look, etc. And I was born into a family of academics. So with an MBA, I'm probably least qualified in the family. Okay. So my father was an oceanographer. He was a scientist. And we have 6 kids. I'm the youngest of 6 children. And my father was very much a self-made man. He put himself through school and college, working, etc. while he did that. And therefore, when we were growing up, money was always in short supply. His salary had to pay for all of our education, food, clothing, everything. And he was also sending money to his parents, and he brought up his younger siblings as well when he was growing up. So if he asked for things like new clothes, the chances were we wouldn't get them. New books were considered though. So buying books was always a priority in the house. And we had this lovely large library at home where you could go and look up whatever books covering all kinds of subjects under the sun were in the house. So that's really the kind of background I had growing up. And like I said, everybody else in the family is a scientist or is in the academic line in some form, and a lot of PhDs in the family as well. So my going into the management world was quite an aberration, so to speak, in that family. And in fact, I found out about the management education kind of option available to me when my sister was getting married and her husband-to-be actually was from IIM Bangalore, in fact. And that's how we got to know about the IIMs and, otherwise it was all the IITs, IISCs, etc. And I probably would have become a scientist like the rest of the family. But then this seemed like an interesting option. I was always interested in computers and, this whole career option became very interesting, and I did apply and managed to get into IIM Ahmedabad, and I did my the PGDM as it was called in those days, and now MBA from there. Yeah, so when we were growing up, there was a lot of emphasis put on integrity. My father, in fact, told us, don't become an oceanographer because whatever you do in this field will always be attributed to my being there here. So go make a path for yourself in a new place. Okay, don't. So he was very, very, I think, firm on those kind of things. A high amount of professionalism. From my mother, we learned a lot of resourcefulness. My mother was the kind who could make a lot of things stretch to meet a budget of, 6 kids and parents and sometimes grandparents as well. She did a lot of things herself, all repairs she did. I remember once when we were growing up, she wanted a little, place in the bathroom to have, kind of elevated area to put her bucket on and things like that. So she found some construction going on next. She went and borrowed cement and sand and bricks from there and constructed it herself. Okay. Yes. So she was that kind of person. She did a lot of things by hand herself. So when this happened, from her we learned, how to be able to kind of find the resources and do things yourself. And from my dad, as I said, the integrity, the professional, the idealism came from there. And in fact, the other influence in my life has been my husband, since I got married very early. From him, I've learned a lot of the drive, making your dreams happen, the passion to kind of follow through on things. Yeah, and in my family, because I'm the youngest and there were 6 people, you could never afford to, sulk or be upset about things too long, because the others were going to go ahead and have fun without you, right? So you automatically, got back into a good temper very quickly. So this was the 80s. Computers were just becoming mainstream. I mean, my father's organization had one which was the size of a room. But then, yes, so the very large ones. But this subject always fascinated me, the idea of computing in general and using machines to do work for you. I used to keep joking as a kid that, so my 2 brothers were just immediately older than me. The older one loved mechanical things. He loved building things, planes, all kinds of stuff. And the younger one was more into electrical stuff. So I would joke that one of them would build me a plane, and the second would equip it, and I would fly it. Okay, so yeah, so I was always interested in working with machines. And when the opportunity came, I was trying to decide between a career in physics, getting into research, or management. And I thought that the management degree would give me a little bit more of flexibility in terms of what I wanted to do. And like I said, it also gave me an entry into the world of computing, which I was interested in. So when I went to IIM, I specialized in systems and finance. So they had a specialization program in systems, which I took, which then gave me the option of, in fact, understanding, say, the world of marketing, the world of finance, etc., from that systems lenses. So definitely the world of the corporate world was very new to me. This whole kind of for-profit sector was also quite new to me. And the good thing is, I think there were 2 or 3 things that growing up we had, which now I realize the importance of. So my father was very particular that all of us had to be able to hold our own in a conversation. So if we had guests in the house, we had to be able to entertain them with our conversation. So even at the age of 6 or 8 or whatever, if a person walked into the house and there was nobody else there, you had to be able to engage that person till somebody else came along. So I think that was phenomenal, because in later years, that's what's given us the confidence to be able to handle things, to make friends with people we don't know, and to kind of find points of intersection. So that was one thing. And because he wanted us to do that, he made sure we read the paper every day, because he said, you need to be aware of things so you can have these conversations. So because of that, at least I had a little bit of a background. At least I knew what some of these organizations did, while I didn't really know much about their business. And that really I learned, from the institute, as well as from conversations with my husband and his friends, etc. But yes, it was a challenge initially. And yeah, like I said, the whole for-profit sector, the idea of making money for its own sake, etc., was very new at that time. So surprisingly, again, we were brought up in a household where my father said that, all of us would get the same access to education, definitely. And he tried to make it equal in the best way he could. He still, of course, had things like my brothers having to escort my sisters if they were traveling out of town. Didn't happen to me, fortunately, but he had some of those things. But otherwise, he basically said that, he wanted his children to be brought up equally. So everyone learned how to cook, and everyone learned how to clean and things like that, which wasn't just the women expected to do it. At work, yes, there were, there weren't too many women. But surprisingly, I think in India at that time, and a place like Mumbai, which is a very professional city, I didn't feel discriminated at work. Maybe it was also the organization, because I worked for a company called Citicorp Overseas Software, where I think the founder, a gentleman called Ravi Apte, was a visionary in a lot of ways. So that whole environment did not make us feel different. So we worked as hard as the men. We were given opportunities as much as the men. We were paid equal to the men, all of those things. And I remember for the first time after I left course, when I went to the US, I was shocked when I heard of the range of salary disparity between men and women, because I thought, and I in fact came back from the US thinking, actually India is much better for a woman professional than the US is. Yes, I didn't find that. As perhaps I moved away from Mumbai and this organization, I moved to Delhi, etc. And as you get more senior in organizations, yes, there is probably more. You feel the gender discrimination a lot more. When you want to make a point in a meeting, for instance, and you want to be the voice, and sometimes you don't get heard, etc. So those things came later. But in my initial career, I did not face most of those things. Like I said, my first job was Citicorp Overseas Software. It was focused on the financial services, and I specifically was in a group that worked in the investment banking and, in fact, in the private wealth management kind of business. So we learned a lot about technology and business. So this was a job where everyone was expected to be hands-on. So whether you came from a management degree or you came from a technology degree, you were expected to code. And even those who were going to go into sales were expected to get that kind of a background because they needed to understand what they were selling. So this was important. So we all got this very good grounding in technology and business. And I remember in COSL, they had this thing called a quality award. And those who won the quality award, and this was given to people who demonstrated a lot of professionalism, those who won that, their names used to be put up at the reception area. And I remember saying, I want my name up there. It was such an aspirational thing for me. And then I got the quality award in COSL. I was so thrilled, okay? Because I felt that I had actually crossed a huge milestone for myself in creating that kind of professional name for myself in the organization. So that was the initial part with the COSL, like I said. And then in 91, I moved to Delhi. And I kind of assumed that the opportunities that would be available to me in Delhi would be very similar to Mumbai. And actually, the IT sector in Delhi was not that well established. There weren't too many IT companies. It was mostly the hardware organizations like HCL that were also doing things in the software side. So the next 3 or 4 years was very kind of peripatetic for me because I spent time, I worked in Delhi, then I went to the US for a year, then went to Turkey for 6 months with my husband, where I worked there as well. And so it was a lot of change of various kinds that were happening to me. And I felt a little challenged because what I had seen as a very well developing career in Mumbai was suddenly kind of changing tracks in Delhi. And then we moved to Bangalore in 1995. My husband was transferred on work. So I must say, the first 6 years of our marriage, we spent, I think, 2 years in the same city and 4 years living in other cities because I was continuing to study. And then my husband was in a transferable job. I was traveling, all of those things happened. So by this time, we said, all right, we should probably start spending time living together now. And so when he moved to Bangalore, I moved as well. And this was very interesting because I had a stint as an entrepreneur in Bangalore at that time. So I worked on my own and also with a couple of partners where developing systems. I mean, this was for organizations like Standard Chartered, etc. And this is where I started doing very mixed amount of work. So it was not only the banking financial services world, but also in the sales and marketing area, for instance. But what I did find is that I was missing the whole camaraderie of an office environment, where you get to interact with people. So this, while I had a few partners I was working with, it was mostly working on it. So when I went back to Delhi in 1997, we moved back to Delhi, I started looking for a job again and not wanting to do this stint on my own. And that was when I joined Pero Systems. Pero Systems had just started the year before. And I saw an ad for them and I decided to go meet the company. And in fact, came back with a job offer from there, which was very interesting. And I got to start working with the likes of CP Gunani. CP Gunani was my boss at that time. This was a very nascent organization trying to make a name for itself. It was a joint venture between HCL and Pero Systems. But again, wanting to not be so dependent on both these parent organizations, but kind of make a name for itself on its own. So this is where I kind of helped build the BFSI business from scratch. I handled large account sales. I got P&L responsibility. I handled strategy. So it gave me a range of roles. It allowed me to develop a lot actually as a professional. So by the time I left 8 years later, I had worked, across the board mainly yes in one financial, but then also in other vertical segments. And I had worked on helping to carve out the strategy, worked in various aspects of delivery, of sales, all of those things. So I think this really helped me in developing myself as a professional there. And this was when I also, started working on large deals. We negotiated some very, very interesting large deals, which had kind of different commercial arrangements with customers. So all of those things I learned at that time. So after, by the time I left Pero Systems, I had moved back to Bangalore, and the job allowed me to do that since we had office here as well. In 2005, I left the organization because their focus on banking financial services was reduced. I felt that since I wanted to continue in that vertical, I needed more space to be able to do things, and a lot of the decision making once Pero acquired the company moved to Dallas. So we weren't getting so involved in the strategy and decisions of the organization. So that was when I joined Capco. I got an offer from Capco at that time. And Capco is a consulting firm that specializes in the banking financial services space. So very much, related to the work I'd been doing in the past. And again, because it was a consulting firm, very much the area that I wanted to be in. So I joined Capco, heading the India setup in Capco. And there were two parts that we had there. So when I joined, it was mostly work being done for global clients, as in a kind of offshore center to Capco. And my mandate was to also grow the India business for Capco. So that's what I did. I signed on a couple of clients. We started doing some very interesting transformation engagements with India-based clients. And we started all that when, and so this was my first stint in actually being the leader for a business completely. Right? So I was the person on the ground, the country manager for Capco, etc. Excellent organization, had a lot of learning in how collaboration works in organizations at Capco. Because this was a firm where they had people across the world. I could put out a request for help on a Friday evening saying, I've got a meeting on Monday and I need to know what work we've done in this area. And by Monday, I'd have all the case studies I needed. This is the kind of collaboration at the very highest levels of the organization. All the partners would respond that way. But Capco then was getting acquired because they were actually in the market even when I joined, and that whole acquisition process took place and they got acquired by Symphony. So I waited for the acquisition to be managed to make sure my team was being looked after in that acquisition process. But since Capco had decided that they would not be focusing on the Asia business anymore, they sold the Asia business, I realized that my role would be, a much diminished one. And again, Symphony was not only focused on banking financial services, they had a number of other verticals as well. And I said, if I'm going to be working in other verticals, then Tech Mahindra was an option, since the whole Pero Systems leadership, CP Gurnani, Vineet Nair, etc., had moved there. And they had asked me if I would like to join. And so I finally decided to join. Late 2006 is when I joined Tech Mahindra. I've been with Tech Mahindra ever since. So I either have grown roots or it's worked well for me. Okay. So I did take a sabbatical in 2008 when I wanted to work in sustainability. And I said, 20 years of working, I'd like to do something different now, and perhaps work on something which, again, was a personal passion, which was sustainability. This, unfortunately, was the time of the global financial crisis. So there was no, obviously, business to be had, but it was also a time when I was learning. So I went for courses in sustainability. I went to Oroville and spent some time there, understanding that. I did some pro bono work for some of the organizations, etc. And then in 2009, Tech Mahindra decided to bid for Satyam. So I got called back, since I was actually in the M&A team before I'd left. I got called back to handle the business due diligence on Satyam. So I went back and worked on that for a month and a half, the period that it took. And then once we became the successful bidders for Satyam, CP Gurnani asked me if I could go down to Hyderabad and manage the post-acquisition kind of programs. So I moved to Hyderabad for a year. I realized that this was probably once in a lifetime kind of opportunity. We had acquired an organization which was much larger than us. This organization was going through a lot of trauma, actually, because of what the founders had done. And so this was the time when, I had to work on multiple initiatives at the same time because we were trying to keep our business, so work with clients to make sure that they didn't pull out business from us. We had to make sure the right people stayed in the organization. At the same time, we were overstaffed, so we had to let go of people. And we wanted to do it in as humane a way as possible, given that it was the time of the financial crisis and therefore jobs were in short supply. So we had to, structure this whole thing as sensitively as possible. We had multiple agencies investigating us. Yes, obviously, the stock exchange, teams, as well as people from the fraud office and all kinds of organizations investigating the company at that time. We had a lot of costs that we had to take out of the business. So there was a lot of initiatives being done around that. We had offices in multiple countries, and then we had to decide where we kept the investments and where we didn't. So, and also we had to decide on the structure for the new organization, because we realized that the fraud was actually enabled because of the way the company was organized. So we had to go through that. So within a couple of months, actually, we announced the new structure, and then we had to do a lot of work to build back the business. So given my background in the BFSI world, I actually started focusing on growing the BFSI business back. And this was one vertical that was probably the most sensitive to the fraud, right? So most of the clients had pulled out of Satyam at that time. And this is where I think I started getting some opportunities to look at new lines of business. And I started this new line of business in Australia for the Australian superannuation, where we combined, and this is what my Capco experience taught me, the ability to combine consulting, IT, and BPO services into like a full stack service. And that is what we put together for the Australian superannuation business, where we became the first outsourced or rather offshore provider for that business. And then that became then, in fact, a platform business. It's one of our largest platform businesses today. And to put it together, we had to really work from scratch. We didn't have experience in that industry. So in fact, the first thing that the potential client told us was, go research this and tell me why it's strategic for you. So we did that, and we went back and said, actually, it does make sense for us to be in this business. This is the ability to combine all of these capabilities. Satyam had made an acquisition of a company called CitySoft, which was a consulting firm in the investment and asset management space. All of these things made sense to actually pull together. We had the technology and the BPO capability, et cetera, so we put that together. And then around that time was when my husband had some, problem with his business. He had a partnership with a partner which was not going that well. And I decided to actually take time off. In fact, I told CP at that time that I wanted to leave so I could help him with that. And CP then, credit to him for, offering this to me. He said, why do you want to leave? If you need to help him, it's probably not going to be a full-time activity. So why don't you work with us part-time? You've created this new line of business. So why don't you work on growing that with us and also help your husband at the same time, which made a lot of sense. And that is what I did. So for a couple of years, I actually worked part-time. I grew that banking financial services line of business in Australia. And I also was able to help my husband with his venture. And then in 2015, when that was settled, I came back again full time. And this was when, again, I was looking at what kind of role I could do, since the BFSI business was obviously being handled by somebody else. And this was when, again, CPK offered this role to me, where we had consulting units in both Satyam and the original Tech Mahindra. So one focused on the telecom business, and the other focused on all of the other verticals. And they were both operating independently, and there could be a lot of synergy in bringing these two teams together. So that is what he asked me to do. So I actually integrated those teams, and we worked on creating a practice-based organization, et cetera. We started that. Then there was a second consulting team that focused on implementing platforms and products for specific functional areas, for instance, supply chain or manufacturing execution systems or laboratory information management systems, etc. So this team again needed a leader, and so I was asked to manage that business as well. And then the third area that we started focusing on, we'd had a focus on digital for a long time. But it was like one team that was trying to provide all of the digital solutions for Tech Mahindra. And in 2015, we did this whole strategy, a 5-year strategy roadmap. And we said, we need to become a digital majority company in 5 years. And if we have to do that, we can't have one unit delivering digital services. It has to be broad-based. So that was when I was asked to become the kind of business sponsor for a team called IT to DT, or the transforming Tech Mahindra from an IT services company to a digital transformation company. So we call that the IT to DT program. So I started providing, some leadership to that team, looking at creating the points of view for various businesses. What we realized is that digital is much more of a business change. It's enabling a lot of business change rather than merely IT. And in order for us to realize the true value of digital, we need to understand the business much better. So with the consulting team and the digital team working jointly, we started looking at how various industry segments are impacted by digital, and then we created a whole set of points of view and solutions. We worked with the vertical teams of solutions. We trained the sales teams, we trained the delivery teams. So it was a huge transformation that we did across the organization. In fact, interestingly, we did become a digital majority company in 5 years as we had planned. So by 2020, we became a digital majority company. So in fact, I think when we started, digital was about 15% of the business in 2015. And by 2020, it became, like I said, more than 50%. But the company itself grew from a $3.5 billion company to a $5.2 billion company. So there was huge growth in the organization and specifically in digital. And this was where I think we started getting recognized. So Forbes magazine recognized this whole transformation we were doing in 2018. And in fact, ranked as number 15 on the list of companies that are impacting the digital economy. And in fact, we were the top services company on that list. Similarly, Brand Finance also recognized this whole transformation that we were doing and rated us again as one of the highest brands on the technology side. Last year, for instance, we got recognition from one of the analysts for having the maximum number of business impact case studies in digital. So this, and from while I said initially I was the business sponsor for the digital team, by 2018, I actually took over the whole team and was leading the whole transformation that we were doing, because we started also realizing that customers were not just asking us for, implement this technology for me. They were basically saying, I have this problem. My net promoter score is negative, or, I need to look at options for improving my efficiency, or, in the shop floor, things like that. So we had to look at what kind of solutions we had across the organization, which is what we did. So that's been the whole role as far as the consulting and digital is concerned. And in between, in 2018, I did this CII program. I'm sorry, the FICCI program, not CII. The FICCI program for women on boards, because I think they were looking at creating a larger pool of women who could be inducted onto as independent directors onto boards. So I did that program then, and I started initially with working on advisory boards. Initially with Triple ITDM, which is a technology engineering institute in near Chennai, and then subsequently with other organizations. I'm on the board for IIM Udaipur Center for Digital Enterprise, for instance. And now I'm also working as an independent director on an organization called Shrestha, which is the organization behind the 24-letter mantra organic products. So, and more recently, I've started getting a lot more interested in social sector. So I hope to be doing some work in that space soon. From the people around me, because I've always had great teams to work with. So initially, I probably when I first started dealing with the team, which I did in my first job in Postal, I wasn't probably that trained on how to handle a team. But even then, I found my team was very collaborative, so they made it a lot very easy for me to do so. But since then as well, what I found is that I think if you're fair to people and you give them the recognition, and you also give them the responsibilities, because initially I did find it hard to delegate. So when I first became a team leader, I didn't know how to delegate well enough. And then I realized that it is important for me to provide opportunities to my team as well. And I started getting better at that. So yes, once you do that and you recognize the team and you give them the support, you also represent their case well enough to the rest of the organization, etc., then you start getting a lot of loyalty and I think benefits from your team. So yes, I've been fairly lucky that way. And I think a lot of the work that we do are things that I am quite passionate about. Okay, so I enjoy working with technology. I've loved the whole digital, transformation that we're doing, and what kind of digital can enable for organizations, etc. So yes, I have enjoyed doing all of this. So I think until the age of 19, I was in Goa, or 20, in fact. I was in Goa. I studied there, and a lot of that childhood was fairly protected, I guess. It was, we were in a campus in my dad's organization. We spent a lot of our childhood playing out on rocks, the beaches, and things like that. Yes, not protected as in safety there, because we were constantly falling into the water and getting scrapes and stuff. But and I'm sure if my parents knew where we were playing, they'd be very worried. But they let us do our thing. And so yes, initial part of that it was all in Goa. And then I joined IMA straight from there for my graduation. It was very different for me because suddenly, you're not used to, you're so used to seeing the sea everywhere around you, and you miss that tremendously. And also, I guess, you're in an environment where you're typically doing fairly well because, studies came fairly easily to everyone. My family, I was kind of absorbing things from my older siblings all the time. And suddenly you're in an environment where there are a lot of high achievers there. And that happens, I guess, in the IITs and the IIMs where you get into an atmosphere. The good thing was that I did make a lot of very good friends there. And I think that helped me to deal with some of those kind of challenges that came there. And I also realized that academic excellence is one thing, but it's also important for me to understand the world and this whole new world that I was getting into. That's really, what I focused on there, both the academics. I was not the highest, the topper, etc. there, but middling, and made a lot of excellent friendships there. Like I said, the first 9 years of our marriage was all about living in different cities. So we spent 50% of the time in the first 9 years actually in different cities. And my husband, for a man of his times, was very, very supportive, open, definitely somebody who talked about share. And I remember when we were having a conversation at that time, and he's 10 years older than me. So he, comes with a very kind of probably a different generation altogether. But I remember very early on, he was telling me that if we start a business together, we'd probably have to, rotate the CEO-ship at some point. So I'll be reporting to you at some point. So you have to keep that in mind. Okay. So he was that comfortable about envisaging something like that even in those days. He's more like a friend and guide. I think very, very easy to work with. Definitely shares the load. In fact, since we moved to Bangalore, he's kind of got out of the corporate sector. He was initially consulting, and then he had his own venture, etc. He probably does a much bigger share of the housework than I do. So he's the one, deciding what menus to have and, checking out what's being done in the kitchen or cooking himself, etc. more than me. Okay. So, like I said, that first 20 years was very focused on career and working and doing things there. And I kept feeling this guilt that I was not doing something in society. And that is when I started this whole thing. Like I said, I took a break and I went to do to work in that space in sustainability. But even though I didn't continue in that line at that time because I had to come back for the Satyam acquisition, I did start looking at how I could apply sustainability into my personal life. So what kind of choices do we make? What is actually impacting the environment based on those choices, etc. And then of late, I have started getting very interested in the last few years on this whole concept of gender biases. I also realized that when we started in this sector, there weren't too many women, and we probably just coped with things. I mean, we didn't make a big issue, but we also didn't fight to make the world equal enough for the women coming after us. So to that extent, I think we let down the next generations in what we did. And that is what I started focusing on, saying, how do I make this now happen? So I started researching the whole concept of biases. How do we actually encourage empowerment? What are the things that we can do to modify those things in society? So I've been doing training programs within Tech Mahindra and sometimes for other organizations as well on both for women as well as for men, sensitizing them to this subject. And it's not just gender, it's biases in general. I mean, it could be racial, it could be, state, it could be language, religion, all kinds of things. So we discuss a lot of those aspects. And then we look at what we can do to identify biases for ourselves and address them. And from a more kind of personal development space, I've always been interested in yoga. Never again had that enough time to do it justice. But recently, I've been pursuing it a lot more. I don't think I'll ever do what I wanted to do in the past, which was to actually become a yoga instructor. So I've decided that now I probably can't do that. But definitely looking at how that. I think as you get into these kind of sectors, it's important to be grounded. And yoga and meditation does give you that ability to be grounded. So the interesting thing that's happening is now a lot of this is converging for me from a personal and professional front. So I've just started a new role from April 1st, where I'm going to be working closely with Mahindra University, collaborating with them to set up a few centers that we are creating there, centers of excellence, one on sustainability and one on social initiatives. So definitely, like I said, that personal passion is starting to get converged with what I'm doing professionally now. Yeah, so a couple of things that I talk about, this whole thing about assuming constraints. Like when I decided I had to leave to help my husband with his business, I didn't even explore an alternative. And I assumed that this was a constraint and that I had to deal with it in this particular way. When I went and spoke to CP and he provided this alternative, I realized I was assuming a constraint that wasn't there, right? So sometimes we limit ourselves by things that we put in our heads as constraints. So one of the things I talk to the women I mentor now is don't assume constraints for yourself. If you want something to happen, if you have a dream, go out and see how you can achieve it. And see how you can work around, whatever things that are going on in your life at that time. I have actually started working with women mentees now, both formally, because I'm doing that as part of the CII India Women's Network program, as well as informally, both at work and outside. And those are sometimes, I don't think these women really need that much of input. All they really need is the ability to see the potential in themselves. And I think if you can just open them to that, they become a lot more confident, and then they become, much, much better able to achieve what they set out to do. And I found that extremely rewarding because I take great pride in them, watching them kind of blossom. So on the professional front, it was, like I said, the CEO of the first company I worked for, Ravi Apte, he was phenomenal in terms of, the highly professional, but at the same time, very open, very approachable. He made it very easy for people to actually talk to him. And he would go around the organization. And you remember we were all just out of college, fresh from the campus, coming into these organizations. And he would come and chat with us, ask us what we were working on. Quite often he would find us, playing games or doing the crossword. And he would never say anything about negative about any of that. He'd come and say, "What's your score?" And then say, "Oh, my son can do better than you." Because he knew that this is a young set of people. If you don't have a project happening, you're likely to do something like play a game. So he never made a big deal about it. Similarly, I think once he was bringing a visitor around, and just after lunch, a group of us was doing the crossword. And he came and said, actually introduced the visitor, and he said, "Oh, these young, bright people we have, they like to keep themselves mentally stimulated." And then he showed some of the puzzles that we had come up with, etc., to this visitor. So he just took it in his stride. And because he treated us that way, we all really put in our best for that organization. I mean, nobody had to tell us. At one time, I think on a project, I would come in on Monday morning, go home on Tuesday evening, come in again Wednesday morning, and leave Thursday evening. And so this was like, you just worked 36 hours around the clock for this organization. Nobody, had to tell you that. It's just that they treated you in this very open, fair manner, and you gave back to the organization in the same way. And he treated everybody with great respect. Again, like I said, didn't really depend, no matter what your position was in the organization. You could walk into his room and discuss things if you wanted. He would actually say, "If you need 1 hour of my time uninterrupted, drive with me in my car, and you can discuss whatever you want with me." So this whole thing about, there was no discrimination on gender, on background, or any of those things. And again, in this organization, as the organization grew, there were a lot of problems that came up because of growth. So what they did was, I think he and the HR head, they actually said, "Form groups. First, tell us which are the top problems that everyone wants to tackle." And then he said, "Form groups and come up with the solutions, and we commit to implementing them." And they did. So it was very open culture, so there's collective kind of solutions being worked on. The other great influence that I've had, because I've worked with CP Gudani now for 25 years, and with him, it is this great ability to adapt and learn. And I think he has that humility to learn wherever he is, to ask for help whenever he needs it. And like I said, to kind of take those inputs and work with them. So I'll give you an example. When I first joined his team, we were the small group of people that we were working on business development. So we used to do all of these technology proposals, and we'd be typically working late in the night trying to meet deadlines. And CP would be there in the office with us. Okay. He'd be organizing for our dinner, transport, all of those things. Quite often he'd be dropping us home, all of those things. And at some point in that whole process, we would want to discuss the commercials with him, and we would go and finalize the commercials with him. But he would wait patiently for that to happen. So many years later, I was telling him that, CP, I don't think I've ever given my team the kind of support you did for us that time. And he said, "Padma, don't forget that I came from the hardware industry into the software industry. I was learning at that time. And I used to listen to your conversations to figure out how software development is done." So I was amazed because he kind of said this openly, saying, "I didn't know and I was learning." And to be able to say, and I was sitting on the side and absorbing what you guys were doing was phenomenal, actually. And okay, now of course he's an expert in the whole digital area and all of the emerging technology areas. But I thought that was phenomenal. And his ability to connect with people is phenomenal. So, anyone who's ever worked with him will still get a call from him wherever they are in the world, etc. So on the personal front, in fact, one of my classmates from IIM Ahmedabad, a guy called Ravi Sridharan. So Ravi worked in the corporate sector. He worked in advertising, and then he worked in the banking space. He worked for HSBC, etc. And about 10 years ago, he decided to come back to India. And he was working overseas at that time. He decided to come back to India and work in the social sector. He worked, again, he started at the ground. He worked with the Azim Premji Foundation. He worked with other NGOs. And then he said, those of us who come from the corporate sector into the social sector, tend to try and bring all of these management principles that we want to force fit into the sector. And we want to look at impact and outcomes and, return on investment, and various things like that. And he said, actually, this is not really helping because, yes, there is a need to bring in more management principles into the social sector, but the way we're doing it is not the right one. So he then did something about it, and he's created a management school called ISDM, the Indian School for Development Management, which has been now in existence for more than 5 years, which trains people for management in the social sector. In fact, I'm now doing a course with him because I'm trying to get ready for my new role in Mahindra University. And I asked him saying, what could I do? And he said, why don't you do this program that we are doing for women on social sector boards, where you can get an idea of the whole ecosystem and how it works and things like that. And I'm amazed at the resources that he's got together and the network that he's tapped into, the kind of people that are associated with this organization who are now coming in and lecturing to us, and in fact, more than lecturing, actually discussing solutions to problems with us. And while this whole sector looks a little overwhelming because the scale of the problems that you're dealing with, it's phenomenal, right? But then you also realize that if you have a group of passionate people working, you can chip away at this problem over time and then scale it like he's doing, because he's been able to take all of those principles that he's learned and then created this organization with others, of course. But he's kind of been the moving force behind this. So I think a couple of poems. One is Invictus, of course. Invictus, which talks about how you shouldn't let circumstances get you down, and how you can still keep your head above everything else that's going wrong. The second is Rabindranath Tagore's poem, Where the Mind is Without Fear. And especially, I think I like that line that talks about how you don't let these narrow domestic walls, the barriers that we put around ourselves with, community and caste and religion and, language and race and all of those things. If you can break all of that and, be free of all of those things, that is phenomenal. And the third is actually a book that I read many years ago. So for a short while when I was in the US, I was working on a project with Bantam Doubleday, the book publisher. And Bantam I love reading, and Bantam had this great, idea of putting bookshelves on all their floors. And the salespeople who were using books for promotion and had extra books after they finished all of those things would put those books out there, and you could go pick up whatever you wanted. And one of those guys actually saw me going and picking out books there, and he said, come over to my office and take any book that you want from here. And he had phenomenal books. And one of the books that I got from there is a book called Ishmael by Daniel Quinn. So that's what actually started me a little further on that sustainability journey. So in Ishmael, he talks about how this person, the protagonist in the book, has gone to learn from a gorilla about how to save the human race. Okay? And so the gorilla asks him something about, what is the story of human life? And, if you were an anthropologist, etc., what would be happening? So he just talks about how, the universe was formed and all of these things happened and how evolution happened and humans were formed. And then he says, if you went back a few, million years ago, whatever, when the first single-celled, creatures were there in the sea, or also just a blob in the sea, and you went and asked them, what do you think they would say? He said they would say exactly the same thing. They would say, this is how the universe was formed, Big Bang, and all those things happened, and planets were formed. And then he said, and jellyfish were formed. And he turns around and says, what makes you think that evolution came to a grinding halt because man was formed? Okay. So that has really stuck with me, because you realize that we are obviously not the be-all and end-all of evolution. And therefore, if every species is as important, then we need to do whatever we can to protect them. I don't think I changed too much, really. I'd probably be a little more forgiving of myself. Okay. And one thing, like I said, I would say, don't give up on your dreams. And quite often what I found is that I didn't always handle situations well enough because I wouldn't put myself into the other person's shoes. So sometimes when you're fighting for things like empowerment and gender equality and things like that, it's important not to get angry and get ahead of yourself because of that, but to put yourself in the other person's shoes and then devise your arguments based on where they're coming from. Because otherwise, and I used to do that a lot, get all het up and then go in, all guns blazing, saying this is how it should be. Whereas now I would probably be a little bit more patient, understand where they're coming from, and then change the way I'm saying things. So I learned something over the weekend in that course that I'm doing with ISDM, which is, it says, don't lose your temper, but use your temper. So if you can channel the anger that you have or that passion that you have into a proper direction, I think it would help a lot. So a lot of things that I think gave me a lot of angst when I was growing up and a young professional, I would probably deal with very differently now. Something that is, I love this whole concept of being weightless. So bungee jumping or, something like gliding, paragliding, any of those things where I could be weightless for a while would be wonderful to do. So yes, that's one of the bucket list things definitely to do. I love traveling. I've been trying to reduce the travel that I do now as I become more conscious of sustainable choices. But I think, again, that's an advice that I would give to young people: to travel as much as you can, see as much of the world as you can, because you realize that all these assumptions you're making about the rest of the world are so wrong when you actually meet people. You realize how much like you they are and how the differences are so interesting as well.